Have you ever watched an entire ballroom decide someone's worth with a single laugh, only to fall silent seconds later because the most powerful man in the kingdom refused to agree? Ethan Carter had. The crystal chandeliers above the Grand Aurelius Ballroom scattered warm light across polished marble floors while a string quartet played with flawless precision, but none of it reached the cold knot tightening inside his chest. Every noble family in attendance had gathered for the Royal Unity Gala, the one evening each year where alliances were strengthened, engagements were announced, and ambitious alpha heirs searched for suitable partners beneath ceilings painted with centuries of royal history. Ethan stood near the edge of the ballroom in a tailored silver suit chosen by his family, though it already felt like a costume borrowed for someone else's life. His older brother, Lucas Carter, moved effortlessly through the crowd, accepting compliments with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his place in the world. Wherever Lucas walked, conversations followed. Wherever Ethan stood, people politely looked elsewhere. It had always been that way. Their parents called Lucas extraordinary. They called Ethan sensitive. Lucas inherited expectations. Ethan inherited apologies. Tonight, however, even Ethan believed he could survive another evening of smiling quietly until the orchestra stopped playing. That fragile hope shattered when Lucas raised his champagne glass high enough to capture the attention of everyone nearby. His smile was charming enough to invite curiosity before his voice carried clearly across the ballroom. "Let's be honest," he said with a playful laugh that encouraged others to join in. "Nobody wants you." A ripple of restrained amusement swept through the guests. Some covered their smiles behind crystal glasses. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances but remained silent. Ethan felt every heartbeat echo inside his ears. He searched the familiar faces surrounding him, hoping someone, anyone, would interrupt, but no voice came. Even his own parents lowered their eyes, saying nothing. The silence that followed hurt more than the words themselves. Ethan managed a small smile, the kind people learn after years of pretending disappointment doesn't leave scars. He straightened his jacket, nodded once, and quietly turned toward the towering entrance doors. If dignity was all he had left, he intended to leave with it. He had taken only 3 steps when the orchestra stopped in the middle of a note. The sudden silence rolled across the ballroom like a held breath. Every servant froze. Every noble instinctively stepped aside. The massive carved doors opened without announcement. A cool evening breeze drifted through the hall as King Adrian Blackwood entered alone. He wore no ceremonial cape, no jeweled crown, only a perfectly tailored black formal coat marked by the understated crest of the royal house. Yet his presence commanded more attention than any symbol ever could. Conversations disappeared before they were finished. No one approached him. No one dared interrupt his path. The king acknowledged neither the governors nor the wealthy alpha families waiting to greet him. Instead, his steady gaze crossed the crowded ballroom until it settled on a single figure standing alone near the exit. Ethan looked up in quiet confusion as the king began walking directly toward him, each measured step leaving an entire room of powerful people wondering why the most respected alpha in the kingdom had chosen to ignore everyone else. King Adrian Blackwood stopped less than 3 feet from Ethan, close enough for the murmurs around the ballroom to fade beneath the pounding of Ethan's own heartbeat. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The king simply studied him with calm gray eyes that held neither pity nor curiosity, only quiet certainty. Ethan lowered his gaze, convinced there had been some mistake. Men like Adrian Blackwood did not notice people like him. They certainly did not cross an entire ballroom to stand before someone who had just become the center of public humiliation. Around them, hundreds of guests remained perfectly still, watching every movement with growing disbelief. Lucas recovered first, forcing an easy smile as he stepped forward with practiced confidence. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing respectfully. "It is an honor to welcome you. My family has been looking forward to speaking with you this evening." Adrian did not even turn his head. The silence stretched just long enough for Lucas's confident expression to falter. Ethan noticed it immediately. It was the first time in his life he had ever seen his brother ignored. The king finally spoke, his voice measured and steady. "I was not looking for your family. The words were neither cold nor cruel, yet they carried enough authority to silence the restless whispers spreading through the ballroom. Adrian lifted one white-gloved hand toward Ethan. It was not a command. It was an invitation. "Would you walk with me?" Ethan blinked in surprise. His first instinct was to refuse. Every lesson his family had taught him warned against attracting attention, especially royal attention. He glanced toward his parents, hoping for guidance, but his father looked stunned while his mother seemed unable to meet his eyes. They had spent years teaching him to remain invisible. Now invisibility was impossible. Slowly, Ethan placed his hand in the king's. Adrian's grip was steady and reassuring, neither possessive nor distant. Together they began crossing the ballroom as guests instinctively stepped aside to clear a path. The orchestra members remained frozen with their instruments lowered, unsure whether they should continue playing. Crystal chandeliers reflected countless points of golden light across the polished marble, yet Ethan barely noticed the room around him. He was painfully aware of every curious glance following their footsteps. Adrian guided him toward the center of the grand dance floor before stopping beneath the largest chandelier. Only then did he face the royal musicians. "Please continue," he said simply. The conductor hesitated for only a heartbeat before raising his baton. Soft strings filled the ballroom once again, though this time every note seemed to carry a different meaning. Adrian turned back to Ethan. "May I have this dance?" The question left the room speechless. Kings did not ask. They declared. Yet Adrian had asked with genuine respect, giving Ethan a choice no one else had offered him that evening. Ethan searched the king's expression for mockery and found none. Instead he saw quiet patience, as though Adrian would accept either answer without judgment. A nervous breath escaped Ethan before a faint smile appeared for the first time that night. "Yes," he answered softly. The king inclined his head with unmistakable gratitude before placing one hand lightly against Ethan's shoulder, and the other around his hand. As they took their first graceful step together, every conversation vanished once more. The ballroom that had laughed only minutes earlier now watched in complete silence, unable to understand why the most respected alpha in the kingdom had chosen the one person everyone else had overlooked. The music flowed through the ballroom with elegant restraint, but to Ethan every note sounded distant, almost unreal. He had spent his entire life trying to avoid becoming the center of attention, yet now every eye followed the slow rhythm of his steps beside King Adrian Blackwood. The polished marble reflected the glow of towering crystal chandeliers while the guests stood motionless around the dance floor, their carefully practiced smiles replaced by open disbelief. Adrian led with quiet confidence, never rushing, never forcing the pace. His movements were graceful enough that Ethan soon found himself matching each step naturally despite the storm of emotions inside him. "You are nervous," Adrian observed gently. Ethan gave a small laugh that barely reached his lips. "I think everyone in this room would be nervous." Adrian's expression softened ever so slightly. "Most of them are nervous because they fear losing their status. You are nervous because you have never been treated with the respect you deserve. Those are very different things." Ethan looked at him in surprise. No one had ever described his feelings so plainly. Before he could answer, the melody carried them into another slow turn across the center of the ballroom. Out of the corner of his eye, Ethan noticed whispers spreading from table to table. Noble families who had ignored him moments earlier now watched with intense curiosity. Governors leaned toward one another. Distinguished alpha heirs quietly abandoned their conversations. Even the royal advisors standing near the entrance exchanged puzzled glances, clearly unable to understand the king's intentions. Lucas, however, refused to surrender the attention so easily. He stepped closer to the dance floor with an expression carefully balanced between confidence and concern. "Your Majesty," he called politely after waiting for the music to soften. "Surely there has been some misunderstanding. My brother is not accustomed to royal protocol. Perhaps I should introduce you properly." Adrian continued dancing without looking away from Ethan. "There is no misunderstanding." His calm reply echoed clearly enough for the nearby guests to hear. Lucas forced another smile. "Ethan has always been rather quiet." I would hate for him to embarrass himself in front of the court. Ethan instinctively lowered his gaze again, old habits returning before he could stop them. For years Lucas had spoken for him, corrected him, and quietly reminded everyone that Ethan was never quite enough. Adrian noticed the change immediately. He slowed their steps until they came to a graceful stop beneath the chandelier. The music continued around them, but the king spoke with a voice that carried naturally across the silent room. Confidence grows where respect is given. He finally turned toward Lucas. Perhaps your brother would have discovered his confidence much sooner had someone chosen to offer him that respect. The words landed with remarkable gentleness, yet no one failed to understand them. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Ethan's father closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though hearing something he had avoided admitting for many years. Lucas's carefully polished smile began to crack. Before he could respond, Adrian looked back at Ethan instead. Tell me, the king asked quietly enough that only those closest could hear. When was the last time someone asked what you wanted? Ethan searched his memory, but the answer never came. His future had always been arranged by someone else. His choices had always belonged to his family. After a long silence he whispered, I do not remember. Adrian offered a warm, reassuring smile that transformed the atmosphere around them far more than any royal decree ever could. Then perhaps tonight is the first page of a different story. As the orchestra reached the final movement of the dance, Ethan realized something remarkable had already changed. For the first time in his life, he was no longer trying to disappear. He was simply allowing himself to be seen. The final note of the waltz lingered beneath the vaulted ceiling before dissolving into complete silence. For several long seconds no one applauded. The guests simply stared, as though afraid that even the smallest sound might shatter whatever invisible force had taken hold of the evening. Ethan slowly released his breath, suddenly aware that his hand was still resting in King Adrian Blackwood's. He began to withdraw it, but Adrian did not immediately let go. Instead, he turned toward the assembled nobles with the composed confidence of a ruler who had never questioned his own authority. This evening was meant to celebrate unity, Adrian said, his calm voice carrying effortlessly across the ballroom. Instead, I witnessed someone being diminished for the amusement of others. No accusation colored his words, yet dozens of guests lowered their eyes. Ethan could hardly believe the king was speaking about him. Throughout his life, moments of embarrassment had always ended with someone telling him to endure quietly and move on. No one had ever paused an entire room simply to acknowledge that he deserved better. Lord Carter finally stepped forward, forcing a diplomatic smile onto his face. Your Majesty, families occasionally tease one another. I fear what happened has been misunderstood. Adrian regarded him with respectful patience before answering. Kindness does not require clarification. Neither does cruelty. The simplicity of the response left no room for argument. Lady Carter folded her trembling hands together, searching desperately for words that might repair the growing distance between her family and the throne. Lucas, however, refused to surrender his pride. With respect, Your Majesty, he said carefully, my brother has always been difficult to understand. He has never possessed the confidence expected of someone raised in our position. Ethan instinctively looked down again, but Adrian noticed before anyone else. Confidence is rarely born in isolation, the king replied. It grows where encouragement lives. It fades where comparison becomes a habit. The statement settled heavily over the ballroom. Several older nobles exchanged thoughtful glances, as though hearing a truth they wished had been spoken years earlier. Adrian finally released Ethan's hand only long enough to remove a small velvet case from the inside pocket of his formal coat. He opened it without ceremony. Inside rested a silver crest in the shape of a soaring hawk, the personal insignia reserved for official guests of the royal household. A quiet gasp spread through the crowd. Such an honor was never given casually. Adrian lifted the crest and carefully fastened it to Ethan's lapel. His movements were unhurried, almost reverent. From this evening forward, Adrian announced, Ethan Carter attends every royal function as my personal guest. Any courtesy shown to him is considered courtesy shown to the crown. A wave of astonished whispers swept across the ballroom despite everyone's attempt to remain composed. Ethan stared at the silver crest, scarcely able to process what had happened. It felt impossibly light against his jacket, yet heavier than every expectation he had carried throughout his life. Lucas's confident expression disappeared completely. Noble families that had ignored Ethan only minutes earlier now regarded him with entirely different eyes. Some offered respectful nods. Others stepped aside instinctively whenever he looked in their direction. Nothing about Ethan himself had changed, yet everything around him had. Adrian noticed the uncertainty still lingering behind Ethan's gentle smile. Leaning closer, though still careful to preserve his dignity before the court, the king spoke quietly enough that only Ethan could hear. Do not mistake borrowed respect for earned worth. You possessed your worth long before anyone here recognized it. Tonight they are simply catching up to the truth. For the first time in many years, Ethan believed those words might actually be true. The applause finally arrived, hesitant at first, then spreading across the ballroom until it filled every corner beneath the towering ceiling. Ethan barely heard it. His fingers rested lightly against the silver hawk pinned to his lapel, still trying to understand how one evening had transformed years of quiet invisibility into something entirely different. Yet amid the growing admiration, he noticed something else. King Adrian Blackwood was not smiling because he had impressed the room. He looked almost relieved, as though an important decision had finally been allowed to become visible. Before Ethan could ask what that meant, the master of ceremonies approached with a respectful bow. Your Majesty, the formal banquet is prepared. The royal table is ready whenever you wish. Adrian nodded once before turning toward Ethan. Would you join me? The invitation sounded so natural that it took Ethan several seconds to realize what had been asked. The royal table was reserved for members of the crown, distinguished foreign dignitaries, and honored state guests. His family had spent decades hoping for such recognition without ever receiving it. Now the invitation belonged to him alone. Ethan hesitated. I do not wish to create more difficulties for you. Adrian regarded him with quiet amusement. The only difficulty this evening has been watching someone believe they must apologize for existing. Ethan felt warmth rise to his cheeks. No answer came easily because no one had ever challenged the beliefs he had carried since childhood. Adrian simply offered his arm with patient confidence. After a brief pause, Ethan accepted. Together they crossed the ballroom once more, but this walk felt entirely different from the first. Earlier, Ethan had moved through a corridor of curiosity. Now he walked through genuine respect. Nobles stepped aside before they reached them. Governors inclined their heads. Distinguished alpha leaders greeted Ethan with the same courtesy they offered the king himself. Each gesture felt unfamiliar, almost impossible. Behind them, Lucas watched in rigid silence. His parents remained equally motionless, struggling to understand how quickly the balance they had accepted for years had shifted. Ethan caught one brief glimpse of his mother. Her expression was not angry. It was filled with quiet regret, as though she had suddenly begun remembering every moment she had failed to notice. The royal banquet table overlooked the entire ballroom from a raised platform framed by tall windows that revealed the city lights beyond the palace gardens. Crystal glasses reflected the evening sky while fresh white roses decorated the center of the table with understated elegance. Adrian guided Ethan to the chair immediately beside his own. A surprised murmur spread through the guests once again. That seat was traditionally reserved for the person the king trusted most during official gatherings. Ethan noticed the reactions immediately. Perhaps someone else should sit here, he whispered. Adrian calmly pulled the chair back for him. The seat belongs exactly where I intended it to be. Ethan slowly took his place, still overwhelmed by the quiet certainty with which Adrian made every decision. As the first course was served, the conversations throughout the ballroom gradually resumed, but the atmosphere had changed completely. People were no longer discussing Ethan as an afterthought. They were wondering who he truly was. Adrian poured sparkling water into Ethan's glass before filling his own. You are probably asking yourself why I came to you tonight, he said softly. Ethan nodded. I have asked myself that question every minute since you entered the ballroom. Adrian looked through the tall windows for a thoughtful moment before meeting Ethan's eyes again. Because this is not the first time I have seen you. Those quiet words settled between them with unexpected weight, and for the first time that evening Ethan realized their meeting might not have been chance at all. Ethan remained silent for several moments, searching Adrian's face for any sign that the king was simply being polite. He found none. Adrian had spoken with the quiet certainty of someone recalling a memory rather than inventing an excuse. We have met before? Ethan finally asked. Adrian smiled faintly and shook his head. Not directly. You saw me only once, and you never knew who I was. Ethan tried to remember every important event of the past several years. Royal appearances were rare, and he had attended very few public ceremonies. Nothing came to mind. Adrian lifted his glass before setting it down again without taking a sip. 3 years ago, I traveled through the eastern provinces without announcing my identity. I wanted to see how people truly lived when they believed no one from the palace was watching. Ethan listened carefully, sensing that every word carried significance. There was a small community library beside an old train station. Adrian continued. The roof had begun to leak after a spring storm. Most people walked past because they assumed someone else would fix it. Ethan's eyes widened ever so slightly. He remembered that building. During one rainy afternoon he had spent hours carrying books away from the damaged shelves with volunteers while waiting for repair workers to arrive. There was a young Omega there, Adrian said. His suit was soaked. His hands were covered with dust from moving old shelves. Yet he smiled at every child who entered because he did not want them to worry about the books being ruined. Ethan stared in disbelief. You were there? Adrian nodded. I was wearing ordinary clothes. No guards. No royal crest. I offered to help move the boxes, and you thanked me without asking my name. Ethan slowly remembered the stranger with calm gray eyes who had worked beside him for nearly 2 hours before quietly disappearing. He had assumed the man was another volunteer passing through town. You bought everyone coffee afterward, Ethan whispered. Adrian chuckled softly. You insisted on paying me back even after I told you it was unnecessary. Ethan laughed for the first time that evening, the memory arriving with unexpected warmth. I believed it was the polite thing to do. Adrian's expression became thoughtful. Do you remember what the librarian told you before we left? Ethan searched his memory until the words finally returned. She said kindness shown when nobody is watching reveals who we truly are. Adrian inclined his head. Exactly. The king leaned back slightly, allowing the conversation around the banquet to continue without interruption. That afternoon I learned more about character than I had during months of official meetings. You never introduced yourself as a member of an influential family. You never expected recognition. You simply stayed because people needed help. Ethan lowered his eyes, embarrassed by the attention. Anyone could have done the same, Adrian answered gently. Many could have. Very few actually did. Across the ballroom, more guests had begun watching the royal table again, wondering why the king seemed so comfortable speaking privately with someone they had dismissed only hours earlier. Lucas noticed it as well, his frustration becoming increasingly difficult to hide. Ethan followed Adrian's gaze toward the crowded ballroom before looking back again. If you remembered me all this time, he asked quietly, why did you never contact me? Adrian's smile faded into quiet honesty. Because I wanted the answer to one question before I stepped into your life. Ethan tilted his head slightly. What question? Adrian met his eyes without hesitation. Whether the goodness I saw that rainy afternoon would survive years of being underestimated. Ethan felt his throat tighten. After everything that had happened, he had begun wondering whether kindness had been a weakness. Yet hearing those words from the king made him realize that someone had been remembering the best version of him long before the rest of the ballroom had finally learned his name. The banquet continued around them, yet Ethan felt as though the crowded ballroom had faded into the background. For years he had believed his quiet life had passed unnoticed, but the man sitting beside him had carried the memory of one ordinary afternoon for 3 years. That realization alone felt almost impossible to accept. Before Ethan could gather his thoughts, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the raised platform and gently tapped a crystal glass. The soft chime drew every conversation to a close. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "before the evening concludes, His Majesty has requested a special address." Curious whispers spread throughout the ballroom. Adrian rose calmly from his chair and offered Ethan a reassuring glance before walking toward the center of the platform. His measured steps immediately restored complete silence. There was no dramatic flourish, no display of royal authority. He simply stood before the gathered families with the confidence of someone who understood the weight of every word he was about to speak. "For generations," Adrian began, "our kingdom has celebrated titles, achievements, and family names. Those traditions have their place. But tonight I was reminded that character cannot be inherited. It is revealed through choices." Several distinguished nobles exchanged thoughtful looks. Others glanced toward Ethan, already sensing where the king's words were leading. Adrian continued without raising his voice. "This evening many of you witnessed a young man being judged before anyone stopped to ask who he truly was. Some remained silent because it was easier than speaking. Others accepted a story that had been repeated for years without questioning whether it was fair." Ethan felt every heartbeat echo inside his chest. He knew Adrian was not condemning the room. He was inviting it to reflect. That made the message even more powerful. Lucas shifted uncomfortably near his family's table, unable to hide the growing tension on his face. Lord Carter slowly lowered his eyes, while Lady Carter watched Ethan with quiet sorrow. Adrian turned toward Ethan and smiled with unmistakable warmth. 3 years ago I met someone who believed helping strangers was simply the right thing to do. He expected no recognition. He asked for no reward. Tonight I discovered that same person had spent years believing he was somehow less valuable than everyone around him. I refused to allow that belief to continue. The ballroom remained perfectly still. Ethan had never imagined hearing someone speak about him with such unwavering respect. Adrian extended his hand once again. This time Ethan stood without hesitation and walked to the king's side. Together they faced the assembled guests. Adrian addressed the room one final time. "The measure of a person is not determined by the loudest voice in the family, or by the highest place at the table. It is determined by integrity when no audience exists. Ethan Carter earned my respect long before anyone here realized he deserved it." A long silence followed, but it no longer carried discomfort. It carried understanding. One by one, members of the Royal Council rose from their seats. Distinguished governors followed. Then respected alpha leaders, honored guests, and finally nearly everyone in the ballroom stood as well. No announcement instructed them to do so. It happened naturally, each person recognizing the significance of the moment. Ethan looked across the sea of faces and realized that no one was laughing anymore. For the first time in his life, he was not being compared to someone else. He was being seen exactly as he was, and somehow that quiet truth felt more life-changing than every title or honor the evening could possibly offer. The standing ovation slowly faded, but the atmosphere inside the Grand Aurelius Ballroom had changed in a way no one could ignore. Conversations that had once revolved around influence and reputation now centered on a single realization. The quiet Omega whom so many had overlooked possessed a dignity that no title could create, and no insult could erase. Ethan stood beside Adrian, still overwhelmed by everything that had unfolded, when the king gently placed a reassuring hand over the silver hawk pinned to Ethan's lapel. "This crest was never meant to change who you are," Adrian said softly. "It simply allows everyone else to see what was already there." Ethan looked around the ballroom once more. The same faces that had dismissed him only an hour earlier now greeted him with sincere respect. Yet instead of satisfaction, he felt an unexpected sadness. He wondered how many years had been lost because everyone, including himself, had accepted a story that was never true. Lord Carter slowly approached the platform. His confident posture had disappeared, replaced by the humility of a father finally recognizing his own failures. He stopped several feet away from Ethan before lowering his head. The entire ballroom watched in complete silence. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I spent too many years believing that success belonged only to the loudest voice in the room. I praised achievement and overlooked kindness. I believed I was preparing our family for the future, but instead I failed my own son." Ethan had imagined this moment many times throughout his life, yet now that it had arrived, he felt no desire for revenge. He simply listened. Lady Carter stepped beside her husband, tears shining in her eyes. "Every time you chose peace instead of resentment, I mistook your patience for weakness. I should have protected your heart instead of asking you to endure in silence. I cannot change those years, but I hope one day I can earn another chance to know the remarkable man you became." Ethan's emotions threatened to overwhelm him, but before he could answer, another familiar voice interrupted. Lucas walked forward slowly. Gone was the polished confidence that had defined him all evening. For the first time, he looked not like the admired older brother, but like someone confronting the consequences of his own pride. He faced Ethan directly. "I always believed that if people admired me, there would not be enough admiration left for you. I competed with someone who never wanted to compete at all." His voice grew quieter. "I convinced myself that keeping you small somehow made me stronger. It never did." The confession settled over the ballroom with unexpected honesty. Adrian remained silent, allowing the family to speak without interference. Ethan looked at his brother for a long moment before taking a slow breath. "I cannot pretend those years did not happen," he answered calmly. "They shaped every part of who I became. But carrying bitterness into tomorrow would only allow those years to continue controlling my life." Lucas lowered his eyes, unable to reply. Ethan offered him a small, genuine smile. "I forgive you. Not because the past was acceptable, but because I finally understand that my future no longer depends on it." A quiet wave of emotion spread through the guests. Even seasoned nobles who had attended countless royal ceremonies recognized that they were witnessing something far more meaningful than political reconciliation. Adrian looked at Ethan with unmistakable admiration. In that single moment, Ethan had accomplished something no royal decree could ever command. He had chosen grace when he finally possessed every reason to choose resentment, and the ballroom understood that true strength had never belonged to the loudest person in the family. It had belonged to the one who quietly refused to let hardship define his heart. 3 years later, the Grand Aurelius Ballroom looked exactly as it had on the night that changed Ethan Carter's life, yet everything about it felt different. The crystal chandeliers still filled the hall with warm golden light, the orchestra still performed elegant melodies, and the marble floor still reflected the graceful movement of distinguished guests. But this time, whenever Ethan entered the room, conversations paused not because people questioned whether he belonged there, but because they genuinely welcomed him. The silver hawk crest remained fastened to his formal coat, no longer as a symbol of borrowed recognition but as a reminder of the evening he finally learned that his worth had never depended on anyone else's approval. Beside him stood King Adrian Blackwood, whose quiet confidence had remained unchanged despite the passing years. Their partnership had become known throughout the kingdom not because it was extraordinary, but because it was built upon something surprisingly simple: mutual respect shown every single day. Adrian never tried to reshape Ethan into someone more suitable for royal life. Instead, he encouraged the compassion that had first captured his attention beside that small community library years before. Together they expanded literacy programs across the kingdom, restored forgotten libraries, and created scholarships for young omegas, alphas, and betas whose talents had been overlooked because of circumstance rather than ability. Ethan often smiled whenever he visited the renovated train station library where their story had unknowingly begun. The elderly librarians still worked there one afternoon each week, proudly reminding every visitor that kindness always leaves a trail, even when nobody notices it at first. The Carter family had changed as well. Lord and Lady Carter devoted themselves to repairing relationships that had once been taken for granted. Lucas no longer sought admiration by standing above others. Instead, He quietly supported charitable projects throughout the kingdom, having finally learned that genuine respect could never be earned through comparison. Healing had not erased the past, but it had given everyone the opportunity to build something better than regret alone. During that year's Royal Unity Gala, a young Omega stood nervously near the entrance, clearly uncomfortable among so many influential guests. Ethan recognized the expression immediately because he had once worn the very same look. Without hesitation, he crossed the ballroom before anyone else noticed the young man standing alone. Adrian watched from across the room with a gentle smile, already knowing exactly what Ethan intended to do. Ethan introduced himself, welcomed the guest warmly, and invited him to join the evening rather than observe it from the sidelines. The simple gesture lasted only a few moments, yet Adrian quietly applauded from where he stood because he understood its true meaning. Years earlier, someone had reached out a hand when Ethan believed no one ever would. Now Ethan had become the person extending that same kindness to someone else. As the evening drew to a close, Adrian joined him near the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, where thousands of tiny lights shimmered beneath the evening sky. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if I had not walked across that ballroom?" Adrian asked softly. Ethan smiled before gently shaking his head. "Not anymore. Because I finally understand that the most important step was never yours. It was mine. The moment I stopped believing the voices that told me I was not enough." Adrian reached for Ethan's hand, and together they looked out across a kingdom that had quietly learned an unforgettable lesson. The loudest opinions in the room do not define a person's value. Titles may open doors, applause may fade, and appearances may change with time, but kindness, integrity, and quiet courage possess a strength that no insult can diminish. Sometimes all it takes to change a life is one person who chooses to see the worth that was there all along.